Idris Elba, who says, as humans, we are obsessed with race, and that obsession can really hinder people's aspirations. Actress Raven-Symoné agrees. She told Oprah, I'm tired of being labeled. I'm not an African American. I'm an American. She says, I don't know what country in Africa I'm from. My roots are in Louisiana. And you don't have to agree with that. But it's a point of view a lot of people have. It should be respected. Morgan Freeman says the way to finish off racism is stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. There's even a movement now to ban racial questions on the census, and many of its leaders are people of color, like Professor Sheena Mason, who says to undo racism, we have to undo our belief in race. The liberal group MoveOn.org, formed in 1998 to urge Republicans to move on from the Clinton impeachment. Today's Democrats should move on from identity politics. It's not working.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Broken News Thursday, June the 13th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the headlines, then my take, and the rest of the hour will be taken up with Chapter 2 of Broken News. All that and a little bit more, and when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
God save our 13 states. Long live United States. God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us. God save our states. We'll fear no tyrants not, nor stern oppressions run, till time's no more. May union bless our land, while we with heart and hand our mutual rights defend on our free shore. God save our 13 states. Long live United States. God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us. God save our states.
This is your chance.
Thank you. And now, Stuart Varney with the headlines.
Tony, have a great day, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow. Varney Company picks it up now. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. This is Inflation Day 2. Consumer prices Wednesday, producer prices today. Now, in the last 12 months, prices paid by businesses went up 2.2%. This is down ever so slightly from a revised report for April. Now, this is going to get your attention. Wholesale prices went down 0.2% in the month of May. How about that? All right, here's the market's response. Interest rates moving down. Start with the 10-year Treasury. The yield is down to 4.27%. As for the 2-year, the yield is there, down a little bit. It's off to 4.70%. Rates down as inflation cools. The Dow, what's that doing this morning? Down about 60-odd points at the opening bell, but look at the rest of them. The S&P's coming off an all-time high. It'll be up about 14. And the Nasdaq also coming off an all-time high, up about 135 at this point. Check out Broadcom. It's a chip maker. It's helping the Nasdaq big time. It's following Nvidia's lead with a 10-for-1 stock split, and it's up $200 a share. Tesla is up sharply. Elon Musk overnight said his shareholders will approve his giant pay package. official results come later today. Tesla's up $11. Bitcoin coming in this morning at 67,700. Oil right around $78 a barrel, and actually down about 26 cents. Gas up 1 cent, 3.46. Diesel down 1 cent at 3.78. All right, that's the markets. Now politics. The president is in Italy for the G7 meeting. Again, he's looking frail and lost. He took all his adult children with him on Air Force One, but not Hunter. He can't leave the country. Biden meets Ukraine's Zelensky. Our president wants to give Ukraine $50 billion taken from Russia's frozen assets. A half hour from now, Donald Trump meets GOP House members. Later, he meets Republican senators. He's trying to unite his party behind his candidacy. He also meets with the Business Roundtable, where he may outline some policy positions. On the show today, a disturbing report on the border. The vetting process is not working, and Border Patrol agents do not have access to all federal data. Disturbing. We'll have more on the growing calls for the president to step aside. The latest is a blast from New York Times columnist Bret Stephens. The most courageous thing that Joe Biden can do, and what would that be? Step aside, Mr. President. And that's in the New York Times. Thursday, June 13th, 2024. Varney and Company is about.
And that was Stuart Varney with the headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
The debate over our president's cognitive decline is not going away. In fact, it is the number one topic in politics. And by the way, key evidence is being covered up. I'm talking about the tapes. It reminds me of Watergate, when President Nixon did his best to keep incriminating tapes secret. They were eventually released and Nixon resigned. The latest tapes are from the hours of conversation between President Biden and Special Counsel Robert Hur. His report, based on those interviews, famously described the president as a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. It said Biden showed diminished faculties. With the president's ability to do the job now in question, it is important to see his cognitive state in the 5 hours of interviews he sat with her. But the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, will not release the tapes. He flat out refuses to have anyone see them. The House has voted to hold Garland in contempt. Speaker Johnson said, okay, we got the transcript and we need the audio. Why is Garland holding on to the tape? Well, obviously because they would hurt the president politically. The last thing the Biden campaign wants is confirmation that the president decline started a long time ago. The president's cognitive difficulties cannot be dismissed as just politics. You can't dismiss it like that. His decline is a national security issue. Propping up an ailing president by covering up his problem is not the right course of action for any attorney general. Unfortunately, nothing will come of Garland's contempt citation. Other attorneys general, Bill Barr, Eric Holder, they've been cited and nothing happened. But this cover-up just adds to the growing belief that this president is just not up to the job. And frankly, with 2 wars and an invasion across our border, it's frightening. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
And that was Stu Varney with the My Take. And again, Joe Biden should resign the presidency immediately. He should suspend his campaign, go home, and get better. And it also reminds me that his wife and his sister are the 2 ugliest women in the United States of America. They should be prosecuted, convicted, and incarcerated for elder abuse, because that's exactly what's going on here. The only reason that he ran for president in the first place is because of them. The only reason he's running for re-election is because of them. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, broken news. Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back by Chris Steyerwalt. And this is Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Turning the Telescope Around. How Media Disruption Disordered News Judgment. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. James Madison, Federalist number 47, February 1788. Social psychologist Lee Ross was fascinated by the cognitive tics and twitches that cause humans to reach mistaken conclusions. Why do people get it wrong so often, even when their rational minds could easily avoid the same pitfalls? People have particular trouble with making judgments about our fellow human beings. Our own lives and history reflect with maddening regularity our species' incapacity to make correct judgments about the motives and intentions of others. Wars begin, relationships end, businesses and institutions fail, often because people just can't put themselves in someone else's shoes. In my own life, many of the worst encounters I have had came from a self-centered starting assumption that another person would think and feel as I did. When people don't behave as we expect them to, things can quickly sour. That's why strategy is so hard. It's not about figuring out your opponent's best next move, but about what your opponent will think would be her or his best move. As my father would cryptically intone before every fishing trip, you've got to think like a fish. But it's very hard for us to really see the world as other people do, let alone a lake perch, even when we know we should. Picture yourself driving on a congested major road. Being the wonderful, selfless person that you are, you have pulled up at the end of a long line of cars to make a right turn. As you sit contemplating your goodness and vehicular virtue, a jerk comes roaring up the middle lane and cuts off the driver about to enter the merge lane and takes the turn. You're going to wait for 5 more minutes to get there. What an SOB. What kind of car was it? Was the driver male or female? What did they look like? Were there stickers to identify their affiliations? Because wouldn't you just know it that it was a white male in a BMW with a Trump bumper sticker and plates from the neighboring state that everybody knows are the worst drivers? Though this is definitely really true about Ohio and Maryland. A woman in a Subaru with a coexist sticker and a kayak rack on the roof, a Hispanic male in a beat-up white pickup truck, a mom in a minivan with one of those stick figure stickers of her family and their dog. As it turns out, it doesn't matter. Your brain will probably jump to the same conclusion regardless of who was driving. The specifics are only useful for filling in the narrative, because whoever it is, your brain will tell you that's how they are. You, thinking yourself a virtuous person, believe that the reason you have waited your turn to merge is because of your fundamental decency. You would never cut other drivers off like that unless you had an extremely good reason. If you were desperately late for a meeting through no fault of your own, or your dog needed to get to the emergency vet, or the contractor supply was about to close, and if you didn't get the part, you couldn't pour the concrete until next week. Or if your daughter forgot her homework and would get an F if you didn't get it to school before the 3rd period. Or if you just weren't familiar with the roads on this side of town. So why didn't you assume that the person cutting everyone off had just as good a reason as you would have? Why did you mutter under your breath about BMW driving narcissists or hippies or whatever made them different from you instead of giving them the benefit of the doubt? Because people are hardwired to see the failings of others as character defects more than as the results of circumstance. Professor Ross was the man who gave that all-too-human trait a name: fundamental attribution error. In a 1977 paper, Ross laid out how the intuitive psychology used by lay people often runs aground on these rocky shoals. Building on loads of research in the previous decade, Ross showed how people struggle to reach the right conclusions about others because they are often blinded by a deep, unconscious bias to attribute personal failings to an individual's character and group. This was part of a profound shift in the way social psychology dealt with the ancient problem of humans so often misunderstanding each other and their motives. You see where this is going. It doesn't take media rage merchants very much to convince their audiences that the other people watching those other channels or reading those other sites are not just wrong, but wicked. That's what the source code in our brains tells us to begin with. The politician from your party isn't a flip-flopper. She's a pragmatist who responds to a dynamic, rapidly evolving world. But that other guy, he's just a weather vane pointing where the wind blows because that's how they are in that party. Hypocrisy is nothing new in politics, and you don't need a Stanford psychology professor to tell you that people are good at making excuses for themselves and their own groups. But exploring the depth of this innate bias is important to understanding how the modern media business model works for national political news. Whatever the other side does, even if it's identical to what your side has done in the past, is not just proof to your lizard brain that they are wrong, but evidence that they are bad. It is by exploiting this powerful tendency that any day's news can be repurposed to deepen divisions and produce arbitrary strife. In 2014, President Barack Obama kept a coffee cup in his hand as he saluted the Marines in the honor guard that greeted him stepping down from Marine One. There was a predictable freakout in the right-wing media about Obama's disrespect for the troops, but this was only a part of a longer narrative from red team outlets that related to Obama's disdain for America and undue deference to foreign powers. Yes, the Obama bows meme. It was a standard of the Obama-era Drudge Report, Fox News opinion hosts, and the rest of the pack. When Obama bowed to Saudi King Abdullah in 2009, it was a, quote, shocking display of fealty to a foreign potentate that spoke to his greater respect to Islam. The depth of Obama's Saudi bow was even juxtaposed with his slighter inclination for Queen Elizabeth II on the same G20 trip. When Obama dipped at the waist to greet the Emperor of Japan, it led one Republican pundit to wonder, how low will the new American president go for the world's royalty? Bad salutes, shameful bowing, tisk, tisk, tisk. The problem, we were told, wasn't just Obama's breach of protocol. It was what it revealed about his character and feelings about his own nation. And don't even get them started about that tan suit. If you don't already know, you can guess how it played when Obama's successor, Donald Trump, bowed to Saudi King Salman, or botched the protocol in meeting the British royal family, or saluting a North Korean general. The same outlets that had milked every drop of potential upset from Obama's lapses and held them up as reflections of deep characterological defects, ignored or minimized Trump doofus moves. Meanwhile, the blue team outlets that had ridiculed the Fox News / right-wing obsession with Obama's blunders themselves went big with Trump's mistakes, often using the opposing side's hypocrisy as a hook. All of these stories were meaningless beyond a quick mention as actual news. But as empty vessels for partisan resentment and anger, they were great. And as Ross and his fellow social psychologists have taught us, it's even easier for our siloed media because the audience does the work for them. Our brains make the connection between mistakes, even small ones, and defective character. This bad salute is because the president doesn't respect the troops. That bad salute is common courtesy. None of it mattered except for one thing. It provided more grist for our narrow-cast, partisan media. Nobody gives the benefit of the doubt or acknowledges the possibility of an honest mistake. The other driver is never taking their dog to the vet or is unfamiliar with the traffic pattern. When they cut you off in the merge lane, it is because that's how they are. Every day, editors and producers go hunting for any story that will either flatter their outlet's target audience or, more likely, show the fundamental inferiority or evil of the other side. They don't do this because they are bad people themselves or even necessarily aligned with the slant of the story. It's just that this kind of contempt is profitable because it is easy to trigger. To get someone to look at a story in an impartial way takes a lot of work. That's because the journalist has to not only overcome their own innate biases, but also have to work to defeat the biases in their audience, starting with fundamental attribution error. And that's risky. Let's say MSNBC or CNN had wanted to explain how Trump's faux pas on the world stage were actually innocent mistakes, or a Fox News panelist defended Obama's miscues. Would audiences be more likely to hear and consider this contrary opinion, or jump right ahead to the conclusion that the pundit, anchor, or reporter was really on the other side? I can't tell you how many viewers and readers over the years have told me that I was on this side or that side, or urged me to change who I was backing. When I explain that my job is to avoid taking sides and keep my analysis as impartial as I can make it, I'm frequently met with something between skepticism and outright hostility. Wouldn't you know it, the late, great Professor Ross can help us with that one too. Ross and his colleagues, Robert Vallone and Mark Lepper, wanted to study the degree to which personal attitudes and internal bias affected perceptions of news coverage. In a 1985 study, they asked Stanford University students to assess their own leanings when it came to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At the time the experiment was carried out, the issue was big news because of a recent massacre of Shiite Muslims by Christian militiamen in the Lebanese Civil War. The charge from Israel's foes was that forces from the Jewish state had either abetted or ignored the killings. After sorting the students into their self-described pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian camps, researchers then showed the subjects identical news reports about the massacre. Each group said that the news reports were obviously biased against their preferred group on a number of objective measures. Pro-Israeli students saw more anti-Israel content and fewer favorable mentions. Pro-Palestinian students saw more anti-Palestinian references and fewer positive mentions. Students from both groups said that an unbiased viewer would have a more negative view of the student's preferred side after watching the report. Perhaps most significantly, students in both camps said the journalists who produced the report would have given the other side a pass for doing the same things for which they had criticized the student's preferred faction. Yeesh. What psychologists now call hostile media effect has been documented in election coverage, labor disputes, immigration policy, and most definitely in sports coverage. Indeed, sports coverage is kind of the template for a lot of general news coverage, especially where politics is involved or can be dragged into the story. I root for the West Virginia University Mountaineers and the St. Louis Cardinals. And I know in my bones that whichever network is covering a game for either of my teams is absolutely in the tank for the other side. Every fawning comment about the opponent and every cruelly unfair criticism of the good guys is further proof of what I knew going in. Our guys get no respect, and they never get a fair shake from the press. If the Mountaineers are the favorites, they're being held to too high a standard. If the Cardinals are the underdogs, they're not getting enough respect. I know that this is foolishness. I know about confirmation bias, the well-documented phenomenon by which we more readily see things that comport with our worldview. I know about Lee Ross's work on fundamental attribution error and the hostile media effect. Yet, there I am sitting with my sons and fuming about Kirk Herbstreit's blatant mountain bias on ESPN's College Game Day. But thanks to the miracles of a connected world, I can now hear coverage of my teams from the hometown feeds. I can watch the Cardinals on Bally Sports Midwest and listen as the homers in the booth at Busch Stadium sing the praises of baseball royalty. I can have the WVU game with the booming baritone of Tony Caridi cheering on every Mountaineer drive, but treating every scoring run by the opponent with the decorum that befits such a sad event. Now that I can have the coverage I want for almost every game, the national broadcasting crews sound even more biased to my ear than before. Since I have flattering coverage at my fingertips, even scrupulous fairness sounds like over-the-top fairness to me. That's why it's helpful to the bottom line of news outlets to spend so much time dumping on the coverage from competitors. It's to keep their own consumers satisfied. Given how relatively little crossover there is between audiences for left-leaning and right-leaning outlets, news organizations may feel the need to remind their consumers just how bad it is out there. When contrasted with the home team advantage for politicians of their audience's preference, the other news outlets seem even more outrageously biased. The message is so powerful because of our innate tendencies to attribute the mistakes in others to wickedness and to automatically assume even fair coverage is slanted against our side. National political news is an especially good vehicle for triggering and exploiting these kinds of responses. The problems on the national scale can more easily be described as existential and urgent precisely because they are remote or unfamiliar to news consumers. If you ask a partisan how to solve the biggest problems they think are facing the country, you are prone to get a lot of simple answers, most of which involve the bad people on the other side stopping what they are doing. If the other people would get out of the way, we could solve the national debt / climate change / crumbling American family / transphobia / etc. Day after day, the stories repeat on a sort of Mobius strip of horse crap. Issues flare up because of some random news peg, or sometimes just because of what people in the news business decide they want to talk about. I laugh out loud every time a reporter prefaces a question by saying, "There is a lot of controversy surrounding," or "there has been a lot of discussion around." Yes, and very often that controversy or discussion is entirely a product of the coverage itself. But those prefaces make it seem like the reporter isn't asking a pointless question in hopes that it might generate a soundbite to perpetuate some buzz, but only responding to some public outcry. This infinite loop of repeating issues includes some left side favorites and some right side favorites, almost all of which can never and will never be resolved. Take immigration, for instance. If you went by the nature of the political debate and media coverage, you would be surprised to see that year after year, Americans are fairly united on the question of what to do when it comes to immigration and the southern border. High percentages of Americans favor strict enforcement of immigration laws and a pathway to citizenship for most people who entered the United States illegally in the past. While the specifics would be challenging to work out, there is already enough of a broad consensus to shape a lasting policy. Except for three things. Number one, our dumb primary system makes support for the needed compromises potentially deadly to politicians' personal ambitions on both sides. Number two, if the parties solve it, they lose it as an issue with which to raise money and try to win general elections. Number three, the news media values dramatic conflict above boring consensus. The issue is always there in the hopper to put back on the conveyor belt when the previous storyline is losing its punch. And as long as the federal government is the focus, it's easy to put talking heads in a box to say that there are simple solutions, but that bad strangers from a different tribe are preventing progress because of their corruption or cruelty. But the same tricks just don't work on the level where Americans actually should be devoting the majority of their attention to news, close to home. You probably don't need me to tell you how complete the collapse in local news has been, unless you're lucky enough to live in one of the markets where there is still robust, competitive, aspirationally objective news coverage. You know how weak the sauce is. Let's first revisit some of our standard caveats. Local news coverage was never perfect in America, and it has often been pretty bad. Just as we have been talking about how national media outlets became prisoners of their consumers' passions and biases, the same is of course true of the parochial press. The incentives for tough coverage of important local institutions and leaders are weak, while the rewards for flattering coverage are strong. If the local medical center is the largest employer in the area and an advertiser, few editors are going to give the go-ahead on an adversarial piece unless there's anything short of dead solid evidence of wrongdoing. Local news should have been and should become more brave, more independent, and more reader-oriented. Lord, hear our prayer. But that does not mean that imperfect local news is worse than nothing. A cop leaning on a lamppost is not as effective as one aggressively walking his or her beat, but it is better than having no police at all. And with the staggering losses in local news that we are about to explore, the hollowing out has been so deep and so broad that it has left us vulnerable to corruption and mismanagement on the local and state levels in significant, dangerous ways. But maybe you are one of the lucky ones. Let's say you live in Kansas City, Missouri. You have the Star, one of the best medium market daily newspapers. It has suffered some as it has changed hands in recent decades, but it still offers robust daily coverage and makes a point of investigative and public accountability reporting. Plus, you have 4 or 5 daily papers in suburban communities or at the periphery of the metropolitan area like Lawrence, Kansas, and Independence, Missouri. There are 5 local TV news outlets and at least 2 radio stations with real newsrooms. There are more than a dozen community news organizations focusing on specific parts of the metropolitan area or cultural or affinity groups. From the century-old African-American-owned paper, The Call, to the hipstery cultural paper, The Pitch. Add to that 10 or so specialty magazines or outlets doing business news, restaurants, etc., and you have a lot to choose from for a metropolitan area of 2.2 million people. Of the 30 larger metropolitan areas in the country, there are several without anything like the equivalent offerings. Riverside, California's market has twice the population of Kansas City, but its main newspaper, the Press Enterprise, was bought out of a bankruptcy auction in 2016 by Media News Group, which specializes in cutting local newsrooms in favor of more profitable regional coverage by making clusters of publications that can share resources and content. The paper has the kind of washed-out, wan sensibility that lots of you who live in medium and small-sized communities would recognize. There are local PBS and NPR affiliates in neighboring San Bernardino, but most of the broadcast offerings are from Los Angeles. Bummer. But if you live in Kansas City, that's Riverside's problem, right? Your politicians and business leaders are being held accountable from time to time, at least enough to create a credible fear of exposure. There's a way to spread the word about good things in your community so folks can encourage them. There's a network of outlets reinforcing a sense of community and shared local experience. It's too bad if Riverside and a lot of other smaller places don't have it so good, but that's true of a lot of things: education, healthcare, law enforcement, etc. Some places have a higher quality of living than others. High-quality news coverage helps encourage other virtues in communities, but it is one of them as well. And virtues are not and can never be uniformly distributed across every American community. Fair enough. But even if you are living in a lush local news environment, you should still care about the encroaching news deserts around the country. I'll make the case in a more detailed way in a bit, but just remember that America can't function as one political entity. Our system isn't just designed to accommodate regional and local differences. Localism and regionalism actually propel problem solving on the federal level. Problems are best solved at the closest level possible to the affected citizens. Only a relative handful of issues fit a national format. But if Americans first think of themselves politically as members of a national party and substantially ignore the important decisions being made on the local and state level, a couple of things are bound to happen. Voters' misplaced demands for action will result in increased frustration and anger, and the innate human desires for meaning and belonging will attach too strongly to mostly irrelevant national political organizations. Our dwindling supply of and interest in local news are big parts of our nation's disordered political attachments. When we talk about the decline in local news, we are mostly talking about the decline in newspapers. As we explored in the previous chapter, even as television came to dominate the media landscape, newspapers continued to provide the backbone for news. They still do today. Just look through your local newspaper site and see how often the coverage tracks with what is on your local evening news. Part of that is the natural overlap with breaking news, but another part is that newspapers are still the assignment desks for a lot of TV news. As I learned early in my forays into TV news, television journalism is a logistics enterprise first. If I want to write an article about something, I need a computer, a phone, and maybe a ride to see what's going on. If I want to put something on television, I need at a minimum a very expensive camera and specialized editing software. If I want to report on the story live, I need a satellite link. And then there's the biggest practical consideration of them all. Is there something to look at? My colleagues who come from the television side of news have had to say to me so many times, is there sound with that? They mean, hey, newspaper dummy, we can't just have the reporter on camera for 2 minutes talking about some boring report. Once we tried to do a TV story about the national debt and needed a way for viewers to visualize the size of the problem. I don't believe the story ever made air, but the dozens of bags of jelly beans may have outlasted me at Fox. TV viewers have a hard enough time consuming news in a format that is better suited to beautiful people doing entertaining things. Even the most serious, journalistically sound television reporters have to use compelling sound and images to grab and keep viewers' attention. Much of what is in print and digital news just can't make the jump. That's why the 1,000-word story you see in a print or digital outlet becomes a 10-second reader by a news anchor. TV is great for breaking news, good for people who want a broad overview in an efficient fashion, and helpful at calling attention to issues. But it just isn't made for doing the kind of deep dives that are needed for civic hygiene. Local TV news not only hasn't taken the kinds of punishing blows that newspapers have, but also the past decade has been pretty good for their side of the business. In 2020, an average of almost 4 million Americans watched local evening news every day, with roughly the same number watching the late news, usually at 11 p.m. or 10 p.m. Another 2.4 million people, on average, watched the local morning news. That was good enough to produce almost $20 billion in advertising revenue in 2020. Revenues have been in a slightly lower register since the post-panic recession year of 2009, but they have been stable and are projected to grow more in the next few years. A big part of what keeps local TV news afloat is all those terrible political ads every other year. In 2020's big earning year for local news, political advertising was worth an estimated $3.2 billion to station owners. Digital advertising is starting to seriously compete for political profits, jumping from less than 3% of total spending in the 2016 cycle to 18% in 2020. But another way to look at it is that the digital ads are financing the TV spending. Online political ads tend to be more about raising money and mobilizing core voters, while TV ads are more often aimed at persuading voters. Advertising research firm Ad Impact estimated that 75% of all Facebook political ads in 2020 were for fundraising. Local TV news is one of the few places to still reach a significant concentration of voters who we know are at least somewhat likely to be civically engaged because they're watching the news instead of scrolling TikTok. It is easier than ever for campaigns to raise money thanks to the same digital phenomena that ripped up the fabric of our news media. But they don't really know where to spend it to get as much bang for their bucks as local TV news. Being the last old media outlet standing has been very lucrative for television stations. As we will see in our closing chapters, that has led to something of a land rush to buy up stations into bigger and bigger conglomerates with the aim of replacing the failing national media organizations. But that's not great for local news either. As you will see, there's reason to believe that local TV is about to fall down the same mine shaft that newspapers did 15 years ago. So when we talk about the decline in local news, we're really talking about newspapers. Without newspapers or their digital equivalents, television, news, and radio just can't do the kinds of work we as citizens need them to do. Other formats include news. Newspapers are sold expressly for news. More than a century of healthy profits and the development of sturdy newsroom cultures had long established papers as the principal watchdogs and chroniclers of news in every market. Print journalism is never coming back in anything like the form in which it once dominated American news consumption. But we badly need a replacement or replacements, and soon. What has made that so hard is the fact that the collapse of the once mighty newspaper industry was so astonishingly swift. American newspaper advertising hit its all-time peak in 2005 with a jaw-dropping $49.4 billion in total revenue. Most impressively, that was up more than $13 billion from 10 years earlier. The dot-com bubble bursting and the post-9/11 downturn had slowed growth for a minute, but as the decade progressed, sales rallied powerfully. Newspaper advertising revenue more than doubled every 10 years between 1970 and 1990. So the increase of more than 50% from 1990 to its peak was slower, but the scale of the raw profits were titanic. The doomsayers who had been warning throughout the same period that digital competition and declining news consumption were a dire threat looked like a bunch of Chicken Littles, right up until the sky fell. It only took until 2010, just 5 years, for the industry to give back the gains of the previous 2 decades. 10 years later, the retreat from 2005's peak was 82%, down to $8.8 billion. That's still a lot of money. Add in the basically stable annual revenue from subscriptions of $11.1 billion, and you have a pretty big pot of cash for providing news coverage, but not in nearly as many places. In 2000, the combined weekday circulation of America's newspapers was 55.8 million. By 2018, it was 28.6 million, a decrease of almost 49%. That wouldn't be such a big problem if digital revenue, ads or subscriptions, had come in to significantly offset the losses. But they did not. And when the collapse started to accelerate at the end of the 20aughts, newspapers slashed their operations to the bone. The University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism and Media report on the American news landscape in 2020 offers some grim data points. Between 2004 and 2020, the United States lost a quarter of its newspapers, dropping from almost 9,000 to 6,700. The closures included 70 dailies and more than 2,000 weeklies or non-dailies, often the only source of news in their communities. 2/3 of America's 3,143 counties now do not have a daily newspaper. Nearly 7% of counties have not only no newspaper, but no alternative source of credible news coverage. More than half of the counties without any coverage at all are in the South. We know intuitively that it can't be good to have fewer journalists holding our local and state leaders accountable. But can we prove it? Economists and other social scientists have looked at myriad angles to try to quantify the hunch we all feel. One study says that in areas with less coverage of the local members of the House, in addition to the expected lack of knowledge among voters about their representative, those representatives didn't work as hard in Congress and were less likely to buck their own party, participate in congressional hearings, to serve on constituency-oriented committees, perhaps, and to vote against the party line. But that may also be true of most poor areas. Certainly there is a correlation between affluence and political persuadability, evident from exit polls, and the swing of the suburban vote from election to election. Maybe it's just that poor areas get worse representation because of a lack of competition and have weak news coverage. Okay, fine. How about the story of the Cincinnati Post, the longtime competitor of the dominant Cincinnati Enquirer? In their 2011 study, researchers Sam Schulhofer-Wohl and Miguel Garrido showed that the 2007 closure of the Post, which had paid particular attention to the suburban communities on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, had at least some effect on how competitive elections were. The next year, fewer candidates ran for municipal office in the Kentucky suburbs, most reliant on the post. Incumbents became more likely to win re-election, and voter turnout and campaign spending fell. They wrote, "These changes happened even though the Enquirer at least temporarily increased its coverage of the Post's former strongholds. Voter turnout remained depressed through 2010, nearly 3 years after the Post closed. But the other effects diminished with time." Kentucky was getting more Republican at the same time, so maybe there are other explanations for fewer challengers and greater ease for incumbents. But that voter participation decrease in local elections ought to give even committed skeptics pause. And there is lots and lots and lots of evidence to suggest that there is a clear connection between less news and less voter engagement. Decreased interest in local elections isn't just bad for preventing corruption and incompetence, it's expensive. In a report for the Brookings Institution, researchers Peng Ji Gao of the University of Notre Dame and Chang Li and Dermot Murphy, both of the University of Illinois at Chicago, quantified some of the cost by looking at the cost of borrowing in cities that had experienced a newspaper closure. The idea was that with less scrutiny, municipal leaders would be less careful with money, less concerned about seeking competitive rates, more inclined to steer bond business to cronies, and more likely to end up behind on their debts, and therefore having to pay a premium for bond issuance. Yup. Following a newspaper closure, municipal borrowing costs increase by 5 to 11 basis points, costing the municipality an additional $650,000 per issue, they wrote. Imagine what that means to a place like Pulaski County in central Missouri, population 53,955 in the most recent census, and home to part of the U.S. Army's sprawling Fort Leonard Wood. It was a Route 66 city that now sits on Interstate 44 between St. Louis to the east and Springfield to the west, but not close enough to either to draw much coverage from the media outlets there. The local newspaper, the Daily Guide, shut down in 2018. So who will cover the county commission with a budget of more than $13 million and a 30-person sheriff's department? Daryl Todd Marina is who. Marina has become a minor celebrity for his Facebook-based one-man band coverage of Pulaski County government. He can't match what the local paper with a 6-person newsroom staff could do, but locals are lucky to have him compared to other places that have no coverage at all. His idea was to go back to the basics for small-town coverage, away from regional or national news and featurey fluff. We need to go back to what was done in the late 1800s, Marina, a former Army civilian public affairs officer, told the Associated Press. Being everywhere at every event, telling everyone what the sirens were about last night, he said. Not everyone is always happy with his persistence, but as one city councilman told the AP, Marina is an equal opportunity agitator who tries to be fair and to be honest about it. But not every place, like Pulaski County, has its own Daryl Todd Marina to remind officials that someone is making a record of their decisions and their expenditures. Knowing what we do about human nature and behavioral psychology, you would expect the scrupulousness of officials to decrease. Like the story in Plato's Republic of Gyges, the shepherd who found the ring that could make him invisible. Even decent men and women will engage in unjust behavior to do what they think is right if they are invisible. They may not set out to be wicked, but without scrutiny, leaders cut corners to help friends, hurt foes, and do what they perceive as good. Are there county commissioners, sheriffs, city council members, and other officials who preside over meetings without anyone watching, who always follow the rules and engage in every correct practice and disclosure? Certainly. But as the research of Gao, Lee, and Murphy for Brookings on the cost of municipal bonds tells us, the general trend is that less scrutiny means worse government. Whether that's because of corruption, like our invisible shepherd friend, or just simple incompetence and misfeasance that goes undetected for longer, it's still costly. One closed newspaper, even in markets where there was another competitor still standing, like Cincinnati, decreased coverage and was costly to taxpayers. Paying an extra $650,000 to issue a bond not only wastes taxpayer dollars, but in a small community might make the difference in a crucial improvement. News is not a luxury item. I should point out here the tension between the idea of too little coverage and too much coverage. I have for years been determinedly against the idea of video cameras in Congress, certainly at least in committee hearings. I am deeply uneasy about the increasing openness at the Supreme Court to allow video coverage of proceedings. The goal of C-SPAN and our Wired for Video Congress was to increase accountability for lawmakers and bring ordinary citizens into the process. Not only have 40 years of televised proceedings had only marginal success in those goals, but video cameras have introduced new problems. Social psychologists have known about the Hawthorne effect for nearly a century. It was discovered by a team doing an efficiency study at Western Electric's Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois in 1927 to see if changes in lighting would increase productivity. What they ended up proving instead was that the workers who knew they were being scrutinized by the experts increased their own productivity regardless of the lighting scheme. It has been proven repeatedly, and though the magnitude of its clinical effects are still debated, good researchers always control for its effects in experiments. But in real life, there's no debate. We know that people behave differently depending on who is watching and how. Try this thought experiment. You are going to carry the birthday cake covered in lit candles into the next room to place before the guest of honor. An easy task and a fun one, since you get to see if you can start Happy Birthday at an octave so low that others herniate themselves trying to match it. Maybe that's just me. Imagine now that you know your entrance will be captured in a photograph. Check your hair, make sure there's no telltale remnant of frosting in the corner of your mouth, and head out. You know that you won't be the focus of the photographer, but instead, the birthday girl or boy will. You have to deliver the cake facing the correct direction for that one shot that you know will be saved, shared, or posted. Now imagine that you know someone is making a video recording. The lights will probably be brighter for the sake of the footage, and you will be more visible to the other guests as you make your entrance. You will want to avoid making a derp face as you navigate the threshold, and might even decide to hold your arm that's shielding the candles a little lower so as not to obscure the shot. With video, you may not be the star of the show, but records of everything you do are being made. If you goof or do something weird, like, say, starting the song Super Duper Low, it will live forever. You may be the master of your fate and have banished the vice of vanity from all consideration, but even the committed stoics among us can see how, for most people, even in ordinary settings, knowing we're being observed can change how we act. Not just that, the method of observation can change us too. Will people be more or less frank in a hearing or meeting that is being recorded on video? Will people be more or less inclined to grandstanding? Will people be more or less likely to seem cooperative with members of the opposing party? Turn on almost any congressional hearing and you will have your answer. I certainly understand the argument in favor of transparency and that the people, whether it be of Pulaski County or the entire United States of America, should be able to see everything that's going on at any time. But there is a difference between transparency and accountability, and the latter is far preferable to the former. There is so much to watch and follow in a land of 330 million people with 50 states, 3,143 counties, parishes or equivalent jurisdictions, and 19,502 incorporated cities, towns, villages, hamlets, and other local government entities. Even if there were a way to get every meeting of every one of those entities on camera, who would watch them all? Having full transparency would actually decrease accountability because important events would just get lost in the ocean of pixels. I've many times been thwarted at least temporarily, by officials who used Freedom of Information Act rules to their advantage. If a reporter doesn't know exactly what to ask for, officials are not obliged to connect the dots for them. By the time you've broadened out your search enough to make sure to capture the emails or memos you're looking for, officials can throw in a whole haystack of other documents to turn yours into a needle. They're being transparent, but not accountable. There is nothing exactly like the frustration of playing a game of document battleship with an unhelpful flack. Any emails between the Secretary and the Office of Compliance between April and June? Miss. Any emails between the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, and the Office of Compliance between April and June? Hit. Any emails between the Deputy Secretary and the Office of Compliance related to the use of official vehicles? You sank my cabinet officer. Video streams and document dumps can meet the definition of transparency, but can actually be a hindrance to accountability. Accountability requires journalists following basic vocational standards with adequate resources and access to platforms that draw enough attention to create economic, electoral, or legal consequences for wrongdoing. Crowdsourcing accountability can certainly work in some settings, but angry mobs are blunt instruments and not useful for providing the humdrum kind of day in and day out coverage that the news is supposed to. For all the reasons we've discussed about partisan siloing and the loss of a shared national news diet, plus some other problems we will discuss more as we look at the unhealthy relationship between the parties and news outlets, putting political proceedings on television invites politicians to perform for a larger audience and discourages the kind of decorum and consensus building necessary to make government work. Make a transcript, maybe even an audio recording. But as we have been taught over and over, from the O.J. Simpson trial to the rise of C-SPAN committee room thespians like Ted Cruz and Cory Booker, broadcasting governmental proceedings distorts them in lots of negative ways. Reporting about the proceedings is far more likely to produce the right incentives. That's why the collapse in local news has been so damaging. For all the dangers of highly sorted, hyper-partisan national political news, there is at least enough interest to create some boundaries for members in each party. The way the parties themselves pick candidates and enforce doctrinal standards leaves a great deal to be desired, but the two-party system still has its advantages. Truly national political considerations mostly can work in the red versus blue heuristic. If you're trying to figure out where you stand on an issue in Washington, the way the major parties have arranged themselves is a good starting place. Again, we know the problems with too much partisanship, but still, it's a very useful signal. In local news, though, questions don't tend to be nearly as ideological. Whether or not to build a new football stadium for the high school, the conduct of the police department, a proposal for using eminent domain for a retail development, an increase in robberies, or the discovery of pollution in local waterways would all intersect with citizens' ideological beliefs, but not necessarily the way they would nationally. Fiscally conservative residents might want a new stadium. Law and order Republicans don't like police brutality in their own local constabulary. Pro-business residents may hate the idea of the government snatching up land. Criminal justice reformers don't want their houses broken into, and libertarian-leaning people don't want dirty water. In Washington, and to a lesser degree state houses, it's useful to talk about issues as being red or blue. But on the county or municipal level, it just doesn't work. This is especially true in our era of extremely well-sorted political geography. We live in a country where only maybe 36 of the 435 House seats are competitive, only about 8% of the total. The chances of real inter-party conflict on the city or county level, therefore, is not great. In most places, the divisions are among members of the same party, not between the parties themselves. What people mostly want from local government is good service, efficiency, and fairness, regardless of how they see themselves politically. This is in part because people know and understand the limits of local government, in turn because they see it with their own eyes. A distant federal government might be a vehicle for an ideologue's transformational agenda, but they've seen the local yokels on the town council and know better than to ask for miracles. You need real local journalism rooted in the community, not just a national product with a local label stuck on it, to produce better outcomes for Americans living in places without vigorous coverage. That should matter to you even if you live in a place like Kansas City, where coverage is both deep and wide. The informational impoverishment of so many places has implications far beyond the direct harms for the communities themselves. We live in a union of states, not a monolithic nation state. Our system is designed for disputes to be resolved and policies to be introduced at the most local level possible. If the town council can't handle it, the county commission may have to come in. The state may eventually have to get involved if the costs or consequences become too great. Only the biggest or most confounding problems, though, should make it to the federal government. But that's not what one would discern from looking at America's media consumption. It is very easy to get national news, almost impossible to avoid, really, and very hard to find robust local news. The clear message to Americans is that the remote national capital is more important to their lives than their state house or city hall, when the opposite is, or at least should be, true. The American doctrine of political subsidiarity means that the national government is a subsidiary of the state governments, which are themselves composed of county or other local governments. The flow is mostly supposed to go from the bottom to the top, not the top down. Consider the decades of savage cultural conflict that followed the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in the case of Roe v. Wade. The court shifted the polarity on the flow of power when it snatched the issue from the states before a consensus, really many regional consensuses, could be reached. Congress couldn't enact a law pertaining to abortion that would please both Texas and California. So how the heck were Harry Blackmun and 6 of his fellow justices going to sort it out themselves? As the Roe decision is finally unraveling after 40 turbulent years, turbulence that warped the judicial selection process and expanded still more the power of the presidency, we look back on a clear case of what goes wrong when the national government forgets to be a subsidiary of the states. States hold a variety of policies on similarly fraught issues: the death penalty, the age of consent, assisted suicide, etc. We seldom, if ever, have to discuss those issues because they are being resolved by leaders in close proximity to their constituents. Californians might not like Texas's rules, and vice versa, but that causes very little aggravation compared to what we have now with Roe. The status quo on abortion and several other issues is that the blue states and the red states compete for national power to try to make the whole country live like either Californians or Texans. The result is an overpowered but still ineffectual federal government and an increasingly frustrated and excitable electorate. Much of what passes for political and governmental news these days is just about amplifying that frustration and intensifying the cycle of federal bloat and bust. Diffused power is good because it acts as a check on the tyrannical tendency of highly centralized authority. But it is also good because it allows policies to be administered in the way best suited to individuals. In a nation of 330 million souls, nearly 4 million square miles, and a $21 trillion economy, the belief that there could be more than a handful of one-size-fits-all national solutions must spring from naivete and or a desire for power. A big part of what makes America great is that we have lots of different pluribuses in our unum. In homogenous societies like Japan, if the mainstream fails, there isn't another ethnic, economic, geographic, or cultural group to move the nation along. Monocultures are risky in societies in the same way they are in agriculture. If you count on one crop to survive, you are unreasonably vulnerable to blight and bad weather. So why isn't that reflected in the news and information readily available to Americans? There are lots of reasons, but market opportunity explains a lot. Having 100 employees for a local newspaper or television station is expensive and has, by definition, a limited area in which to seek profits. The same 100 salaries could produce national coverage that would have far greater possibilities for return on investment. We don't know if more high-quality local news coverage would reverse America's slide toward centralized power and populist rage politics, but we certainly know weak local coverage has both contributed to and been driven by that slide. There is good news on this front, but we are still a long way from success. We will address some of the proposals and philosophies for getting there in our closing chapters, but the most important work here is educational. Getting more Americans to understand how important local news is to the health of our system is crucial. It's easy to hate a stranger who lives in a distant part of the country. If you are a Democrat living in the Pacific Northwest, the cartoon version you see of Republicans in the South or Appalachia on the national news would easily lead you to conclude that you and they aren't just from different cultures, but different species. You might believe almost anything about them, that they want to disenfranchise black voters, have deportation police raiding the homes of otherwise law-abiding illegal immigrants, and ban birth control. If you are a Republican in the South, you might believe that Democrats in the Pacific Northwest want no election security, open borders, and the abolition of gender. Not that some small minority of people in the other places want those things, but that all of the people there are that way. And why not? What Fox News shows you about Seattle or what MSNBC shows you about Alabama is mostly going to reinforce your stereotypes. The reasonable conclusion based on limited information then would be that those strangers aren't just wrong, but bad. They are so far removed from your group, they can be safely hated without triggering too much thinking about the commonalities that connect us as Americans. Remember the problem of fundamental attribution error. We tend to see the failures of others as the result of characteristic traits more than we should. You know how they are. If national media is our primary source of news, political disagreement will increasingly not take place among members of the same tribes who have shared cultures and experiences, but instead between distant, foreign entities. And because of our tendency to see errors as characterological rather than situational, we can quickly conclude that the people we think are wrong are just bad people. And who cares about being civil to a bad person? Giving the benefit of the doubt to a bad person sounds foolish. It's harder to hate someone who lives in the same place as you, roots for the same teams as you, sits in the same traffic as you, and faces many of the same joys and challenges as you. Our local communities are the correct building blocks for a healthy national political system, but that can't happen without lots of local news consumption.
And that was Chapter 2, Turning the Telescope Around, from Broken News, Why the Media Rage Machine, Divides America, and How to Fight Back by Chris Steyerwalt. Now, there's 2 chapters, and both of them are, to put it bluntly, boring. I'm going to give it a chapter or 2 more, and if he isn't picking it up in the next couple of chapters, I'm going to dump this book. Back in a minute. Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.